Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. The most important questions in politics and in political science really revolve around what sustains concentrations of power and what creates, maintains, and transforms institutions and structures of power. These are really the most enduring questions in politics because politics is about power. We even define politics as the human activity by which we create, maintain, and change the general rules under which we live. And so when we examine political questions, we gravitate towards questions of survival and questions of the fate of different institutions or different structures, parties, types of political regime, economic institutions. And in regime studies, it's no different. In authoritarian politics, or the comparative turn in authoritarianism, the biggest questions really revolve around the relative endurance and survival rate of different types of authoritarian regime. And the type that seems to survive the longest is the single party authoritarian regime, the kind characterized by organizational rule by the organs of a single political party. Today in class, we're going to focus on the politics and the political economy of the survival of one party authoritarian regimes. And this is really kind of a bellwether for even more general questions about the survival and the perishing of different kinds of institutions in different structures of power. And in this case, we're discussing types of authoritarian regime. And so it's important for us to take into consideration questions about the organization of power within these regimes, but we'll also pay attention to bigger questions about the survival of these regimes and the mechanisms that reproduce them. And more generally, we'll step back later on and pay attention to the political economy of these regimes and why they survive or why they perish. And so you'll see a lot of familiar content in here, but this is a lecture about the politics and the political economy of institutional development. And we're choosing to focus in particular on one party authoritarianism because it is the most resilient of the types of authoritarian regime. Now, let's step back and begin at a more basic conceptual level. These are basically just authoritarian regimes characterized by organizational rule by the organs of a single political party. And the type of political party can vary. It often has to do with a founding moment like a revolution, like, for example, the Mexican Revolution, or a misappropriation of power that occurred after winning fair and square in a democratic election. And there are examples of this that are numerous as well. And so Viktor Orban's party in Hungary might be an example, although in that case, it might not be a clear-cut instance of one-party authoritarian rule. Anyway, let's continue. The most obvious example is the communist regime. And we think of this first when we think about one-party rule, because Asia in particular has, to this day, a lot of lasting, enduring, surviving one-party communist regimes, and those are in China, Vietnam, and Laos, respectively. But in the 70s, there were 20 of these. And between 1979 and 1989, almost all of the one-party regimes that were alive at the start of that period survived. And the Communist Party regimes did slowly perish in the 90s, of course, and this collapse of the Soviet Union also had a big impact. But the durability of this regime type is noteworthy, and the survival of the communist regimes in Asia is worth analysis, and we'll get into that here momentarily. But these one-party regimes can also appear after critical moments like decolonization in Africa, where remember that these are places where the borders and the lines were drawn arbitrarily by colonial powers, where the institutions are of varying quality and strength because they were largely set up and maintained with the interests of the colonial power in mind, and where the state is quite weak and where different groups have very conflictive in contradictory interests at the start of the post-colonial period. And consequently, in Africa, a lot of authoritarian regimes popped up because of the weakness of the foundations for democratic rule. The one party regimes were relatively common because anyone who could monopolize power, however that looked, was able to fill the void, so to speak. And so in many cases, it was military rule, but in many cases, it was a single party regime too. Good example of a single party regime in Africa is Botswana. It's a place where a single party allowed some degree of electoral competition, but ultimately really ruled by tilting the playing field and kind of monopolizing the state, and ultimately created what was effectively a form of one party rule, and or at least de facto one party rule. And there are other examples. In the case of Botswana, the party was very effective in developing the state and investing in public infrastructure and making a lot of long-term investments that would prove quite beneficial for the country. We'll talk later about some of the incentives and some of the benefits that single parties have when it comes to investing and strengthening the state, particularly for the purposes of distributing patronage and supplying potential supporters with their own reason to support the party and keep the, the power structure in place. Now, more generally, these single party regimes are noteworthy because they're so resilient. And so for us as political scientists and as political economists, we want to know what are the political and economic foundations of this durability, and why is it that they tend to stay in power for so long? A starting point is an important observation, which is that the party cadres or the members of the party, they prefer staying in power over all else. Their fundamental interest is in staying in power. Take a military regime, by contrast. The military junta is more concerned ultimately about maintaining the integrity of the institution of the armed forces, and that often involves maintaining internal unity and stepping away and stepping out of power at the moment when the junta begins to break down and the different commanders of the armed forces begin to come into conflict. In the case of a single party regime, it's very different. They don't have any life after politics. There is no military, there is no church, there isn't even a royal family, frankly, to fall back on. There is the party, and that is it. And so from the get-go, party cadres or party leaders have a very strong preference for staying in power above all else because there is no alternative. And this helps us to begin to understand why these things stick around for so long. But before we get into a little bit more detail, let's take a look at the anatomy, I should say. I almost said autonomy. The anatomy of one party rule in Vietnam. And as in China, as in Laos, and as in many cases in Africa, including Botswana, all political bodies and state institutions are under the control of Communist Party organizations. bodies of the Communist Party. This is what we call organizational parallelism. It's where the organization that rules another organization sets up offices that parallel and sort of mirror the offices and the structures of the organization that they're monopolizing. And they do it expressly to develop the strength and the capacity of the party to monopolize the state. And this is an essential tactic because it requires a great deal of coordination and organization, investment, upkeep, and maintenance. It also helps us to understand why their fate becomes so tightly tightly wedded to the fate of the regime itself because it literally involves a merging of the party and the state. And so in the case of Vietnam, for instance, the Politburo, its first top, excuse me, top four posts are as follows: the party general secretary, which is leader of the party, the general minister of public security, the state president, and then the prime minister. And so it gives you a sense of the overlap between the party and the state. And then more generally, the party secretariat, which is another wing of the party, oversees all policy making. Party secretariat itself is a part of the Politburo. And so the merging of the Politburo with the party secretariat has an essential function. It serves to connect the party to the policy-making organs of the Vietnamese state. And in this regard, they almost become indistinguishable. And this is the objective for the bodies of the party and the bodies of the state to begin to be viewed as one. And for a similar reason, parties in one party states often also develop a, a sort of enduring ideology or a relatively coherent body of thought or set of ideas. Now, it's not a totalitarian regime. North Korea is a totalitarian regime. They use ideology for the purpose of brainwashing individuals. But in a one party regime where there may even be some degree of electoral competition, but where the party dominates the state, there is a role for ideology and for filling the gap where institutions and organizational parallelism can't completely satisfy all the needs of the party when it comes to filling the political space from thought to law to institution and everywhere in between. This is an interesting example, Vietnam. China is an interesting example too, because China is an example of a one party authoritarian regime. It's a communist one party authoritarian regime. And the thing about China that's interesting, and that I think we often forget, is that the Chinese state is still by far the single most dominant actor in the economy in China. In fact, well more than half of the largest firms in the country are state owned and get their financing from state banks and are part of 5-year plans that are assembled by the Communist Party, which, as in Vietnam, monopolizes the state through a form of rigorous and very thorough organizational parallelism. It's an example of a one party state. But what's interesting, and this is where we as political economists have a lot to say, is that there's an important role for the state's role in the economy. It's not just that it's a communist party and that, communist parties control the state. Sure, that was how it started, more or less. But there's also a political logic and there's a political economic reason why single party regimes tend to be highly involved in the state. And I'll tell you and explain later that this has to do with the ability of parties to politicize public resources under a circumstance of state involvement in the economy. When there's a large public sector, the party can monopolize the public sector and can use it to distribute patronage, develop and build support among middle and working class groups in society who might otherwise take up arms or even rebel against them. it allows them to distribute economic benefits and, in a sense, co-opt or buy off or purchase the loyalty of sectors of society who might be increasingly conscious of what's going on and desirous of a democratic transition. And so in China, it's not just the case that the Communist Party is communist. It's also the case that it's a single party dominant regime that rewards a public sector that provides the party with opportunities to distribute patronage and maintain popular and wider support, as well as the support of those elite sectors that benefit from that public sector as well through contracts, guided investment, credit, tax or subsidies, abatements, you name it. So let's watch a video though about China. And this is an inside look at the National Congress in 2016, which was the most recent of the national congresses. They have one every 5 years, the Communist Party, and they always determine the sort of future, or they make decisions about succession or leadership. In this particular case, the big question was whether Xi Jinping would be able to remain in power and sort of concentrate power well into the future through this National Congress. So it was a big political question, but I want you to focus on the merging of party and state institutions. They're indistinguishable. Are we talking about the party or are we talking about the state? You can't actually tell. That's the whole point. And I want you to notice something else too. Notice that the conflict in the question about whether Xi Jinping would remain the premier is taking place entirely within the party. It's not as if this is spilling out into the open in that they're defecting and peeling off and threatening to form competing or rival groups. That's unthinkable and unimaginable in this context. It's unimaginable precisely because of how encompassing and thoroughly embedded the Communist Party is in the state in China. And so the entire point of this discussion is that the state and political and party institutions have become one, and the conflict is taking place within the purview of the party. And the party in the single party regime is functioning effectively to internalize conflict in that way. And this is one of the reasons that these single party regimes stay in power for so long and why they tend to endure. So let's watch the video and then come back.
What are the moments we'll all be talking about in the year ahead? It only happens once every 5 years. It's the biggest event in China's political calendar, and it determines who will rule the world's rising superpower for the next 5 years. The Communist Party's 19th National Congress takes place in October 2017, and it's set to be the backdrop for China's President Xi Jinping to take on ever more power.
He is already perhaps the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao, and this Congress is likely to enhance that trend and see him emerge even more powerful. We'll set the Politburo, which is the 25-man group which runs the country, and within that, the 7-man standing committee, who are the most important people in the country who run it.
The Congress is normally an orderly changing of the guard, but this time the transformation will be sweeping.
This one is particularly significant because so many of the old leadership are scheduled for retirement. Of that top 7-member standing committee, which is the most important body in the country, 5 are due to retire. Only the country's leader, Xi Jinping, and the Prime Minister are likely to stay on. So it gives a chance to rule with his own people at his side, chosen by him.
And this will signal if Mr. Xi intends to stay in power beyond the 10 years now standard for Chinese leaders.
They've all retired after 2 terms. He may well, some people think, have a eye to staying on beyond 2022, well into his 70s as the country's leader. The optimistic interpretation is that he is accumulating power because he wants to reform the economy, wants to pursue radical reform, and there are vested interests in his way that he needs to get rid of. The pessimistic interpretation is that he's accumulating power because he likes it.
Either way, it's likely to trigger a major bout of political infighting behind the scenes at the Congress. That spells uncertainty at a time when China's relationship with America is in question.
China should love us. But you know what? They're making a fortune off us. They're taking our jobs, our money, everything.
If America really does pursue the protectionist course that Donald Trump is threatening, it would be disastrous for the Chinese economy, disastrous for relations between the two countries. And yes, China must be extremely concerned about that.
And the fallout from that could be felt the world over.
Xi Jinping has embarked on a course of challenging American strategic superiority in the Western Pacific around China's own borders. That matters in a world where he will be confronting an America led by President Trump, whose intentions towards China are not clear. So the risk of confrontation is quite high.
Now, the whole point is that this conflict was taking place within the Communist Party. Any question about Xi's tenure in office or who would succeed him or not took place within the party. That debate was something that was internalized. And so what's also notable about that video is that the commentators suggest that one view is that Xi might reform the economy and presumably deepen liberal reforms through privatization, and maybe other kinds of liberalization. But the perspective that I've been developing in this lecture suggests that's highly unlikely. If single party authoritarian regimes rely on the ability to politicize public resources, shrinking the state sector through privatization would be a terrible strategy, because then you wouldn't have the state sector to use as an instrument for distributing patronage and maintaining the support of working and middle classes, who presumably disproportionately work in state firms that are still more than half of the share of the Chinese economy. And so I would disagree with that suggestion. It seems to me, and it may be interesting to hear from you as well, that as a political actor, she is seeking power within the party in the ways that politicians would. And the rules of the game in China are the rules of the Communist Party. And so any conflict about power sharing or the tenure of a leader is going to take place within that umbrella, within that structure. And so it looks like just a good old power struggle within a party. But the point is that the Communist Party is functioning effectively. The single party regime is functioning the way we would expect it to, where we see party cadres preferring remaining in power above all else, and therefore being unwilling to take it into the streets, so to speak, or to form a rival political group, or so on and so forth. Grady says, so in a sense, the leader is not untouchable under the Chinese form of government. The party is actually the one that holds most of the power, right? Well, Grady, I think it's more like the party is just like the strategic context. The party just organizes a power struggle between elites. So, in China, to the extent that a decision-making process takes place, or that politics takes place, it takes place within the Communist Party. And so that's essentially a group of elites who've constructed this set of institutions in this sort of political vehicle for internalizing conflict, for sort of sharing and power and kind of dispersing in parceling out power, but ultimately for dominating society. And so consequently, in China, to the extent that they have elections, the Communist Party selects the slate of candidates that voters get to choose from. But the process of arriving at that slate of potential candidates is a process that takes place within the party. And so when we say that the party holds most of the power, Well, what is the party? It's really just like a stage or like a battleground where the elites who are capable enough or who have strong enough alliances with other elites are duking it out, so to speak. It's just that what's striking about the battlefield, the single party regime framework, is that it works to internalize the disputes because the leaders don't have any other incentive but to prefer to stay in power and to sort of sort out their disagreements within the party as opposed to peeling off or carrying out a rogue or a dissident coup or something like that. So this is part of the reason why these systems tend to remain in place. But let's spell it out in more explicit terms. And what we know and in the way we can understand the survival of these one party regimes is in the following way. On a political level, rival factions really don't have any incentive to break off. That party has already monopolized the political space. There's no chance that you could form a rival faction strong enough or capable enough of displacing that party. Organizational parallelism has made it virtually impossible to dislodge that ruling party. And so rival factions have an incentive to stay within the party and sort out their differences and engage in a power struggle behind the scenes as opposed to outside of the party. Secondly, these regimes can weather the death of founders and leaders because the party is not it's not a vehicle devoted to the namesake or the icon of any specific leader. It's not a personalist regime. It's not like a bizarre sort of cronyistic hyper personalistic regime like are common in Central Asia, where there's like no basis for the laws. They ban certain kinds of haircuts. The leaders create huge golden statues and theme parks that all have the theme of them or their family. Just bizarre stuff. Just no rationale, no basis for any of that. But a single party regime, by contrast, it can weather the death of any founder or individual leader because from the beginning it was set up to be a vehicle for competing internally to take the mantle of political power that has already been won. See, that's the key. The party has already taken power. Now it's just a matter of a power struggle within the party. And so anyone who dies or passes away, that's not an issue. Someone will fill their shoes and take their place, and there will be a natural process within that party, a power struggle, so to speak, that will result in some new setup. But the party itself will remain the operative vehicle. And then third, these parties use patronage, and specifically they use public resources. They use the state to claim the loyalty of citizens and really to dispense patronage, jobs, cheap services, subsidized transportation, cheap fuel, you name it, right? They use the state, they use access to public resources to co-opt large sectors of society who otherwise might withdraw their support and demand liberalization or a democratic transition. So this is where we begin to discuss the economic component. Why is it that single party regimes often also have a huge state apparatus, a large state sector with extensive industries, large service sectors, large service delivery? Well, this perspective suggests that there's a political reason for that because it creates opportunities and resources that the regime can use to dispense patronage and build support among sectors that otherwise might withdraw their support. Fourth, personalist regimes are cliquey. They often dispense benefits or privileges on people who have a close link to the ruling family or the individual personality. But a one party regime is different because they're sort of more generic and they have an incentive to be open to all citizens who might choose to give their loyalty to the party. So, for instance, in Central Asia, some of those personalistic regimes dispense benefits disproportionately on people of the same group or close to the dictator. And what this means is that those personalist regimes are liable to falter if other actors in society who feel neglected turn on the regime and organize and maybe act collectively to try to demand the ouster of the regime. Let me close the door real quick. And then finally, these parties, to the extent that they're generic, they're very unlikely to limit their constituency to a particular clan or region or group. They only have an incentive to remain in power. And for this reason, they have a strong incentive to simply develop a large enough or the single largest constituency that they can without regard for anything. And in this respect, they're quite inclusive. But of course, we know that it's because they're concentrating power for the purpose of remaining in power and ruling in their own interest. But the thing is, and the key point here is that the institutions and the characteristics of the regime actually reward relatively responsive or relatively encompassing transfers, even if those transfers are essentially clientelistic and essentially patron client relations oriented, if you will. And when I say patronage, I mean that they're essentially purchasing the support of people in society, right? They're creating jobs and they're putting people on the rolls. In fact, a common practice is what's called feather bedding, where they create these large state enterprises in big industries or service sectors, and then they just hire an unlimited number of people, and they have like twice as many people as they need on the books, but they're kept on the books and they're hired simply for the sake of hiring people and co-opting them in obtaining their support or at least their complacency. And so this was common in Argentina under military rule, but it's especially common under one party rule because the party monopolizes the state and uses public resources to to develop and maintain support. Now, I want us to focus more on these questions of regime survival from a political and economic perspective. We've focused a lot on the politics, but we want to better understand the economic dimension and what political economic features of one party rule, once it is established, might help it to remain in power or continue to remain in power. And this is a conversation that begins to draw on concepts that we understand well in this class, concepts like privatization and public sector and public investment in the role of the state more generally, and the difference, for instance, between an ISI or an import substitution industrialization oriented model and more of a neoliberal model. And what I want to suggest to you is that one party regimes tend toward the ISI or statist or state guided model for political expediency and for political reasons. And that the political economy of one party rule is really the political economy of a large public sector and a complacent and obedient public bureaucracy, one that functions as really a strategic instrument of the party. And the example of China helps us to begin to understand that. But we're also going to take a look at the example of Mexico under the PRI between, I believe, 1929 and 2000. And this is another example of one party rule that was partly driven forward and sustained by a reliance on a large state sector and the dispensing of patronage for the purpose of building and maintaining support. And this is the political economy. This is how we begin to think about the economic dimension in the political economic component. So what we know is that the key variable is really the politicization of public resources for partisan purposes. So using public resources and, and public investment resources for political gain. Another way to think of this is stealing for the team. The idea that you are in public office or power, elected or unelected, and you are intentionally dipping in to the public cookie jar and taking for the purpose of of the benefit of the party. Now, this obviously looks more complicated in practice and more careful. For instance, using state resources to set up large public enterprises, well, hiring people under the auspices of the the promotion of the party and the ideology or the objectives of the party and the vision of the party, that would certainly fall under partisan purposes, although it would also be the use of public resources. The point is that there's sort of a stealing or a governing or a politicizing for the team aspect of this, and it has to do with the use of public resources. This means that co-opting society has everything to do with these transfers and with dispensing dispensing goods within groups or across groups or in whatever way is necessary to avoid severe repression and co-opt and build the support of specific groups. Now, what this means is that by the same token, privatizing state enterprises and getting rid of and shrinking the state puts the state's fiscal power out of reach of the party. The state can no longer be used as a political instrument, can no longer be used to the party's advantage if you shrink the size of the state and privatize all the public resources that are used ordinarily to dispense patronage by hiring people and keeping them on for the purpose of co-opting them and maintaining their support, or at least lulling them into complacency in preventing a loss of power for the regime. This is all about using the public sector and using the state for political gain and making economic and political economic choices designed to promote the interests of the party. This explains a great deal. It helps us to understand, for example, why there are so many communist one party regimes, both in history and at present. It helps us to understand why so many one party regimes have highly statist policies, where they are heavily involved in the economy and highly interventionist in terms of the creation of state enterprises, often in very strategic sectors that can sometimes be in service sectors or related to specific public goods that might be important to the development of support for the party. Botswana, for example, is noted for its extensive public investments and its large state sector. I already said Botswana is a good example of a single party regime, a example of a semi-competitive but ultimately single party authoritarian regime. Is that a coincidence? From this perspective, it is not a coincidence. There's a reason that single party regimes tend to expand the state sector, maintain the state sector, avoid privatization, and more generally use the state sector strategically to dispense patronage. Communist one party regimes are obviously a good example of this too, because communism is literally the dissolution of the boundary between private and public, and the idea that the public sector becomes all encompassing and encompasses everything to the extent that everything is a public investment and therefore ultimately a political opportunity or a chance to promote the party. So this is a political economic perspective on this the survival of one party regimes. This suggests that there is an important role for the state as well as is the state's role in the economy and how the party uses that to its advantage. A good example is the case of Mexico from 1929 to 2000. This is a period where the country is ruled continuously without interruption by the Institutional Revolution Party. This is the party that emerged from the Mexican Revolution. And ironically enough, the Mexican Revolution was waged in opposition to a dictator who had been democratically elected but who had never left office. And so the PRI emerged from the Mexican Revolution, which was a democratic revolution, fought for democratic reasons, but then stayed in power for almost a whole century against democratic principles. So very ironic, but more importantly, and more analytically, and for our purposes, how did they stay in power? How did the party monopolize power and do this? Especially considering that much of Latin America was extremely unstable for this entire period, oscillating between democratic and military rule, between governments of the left and the right, and so on and so forth. Well, they did it through patronage and corruption, and they did it through the expansion of a very large state sector, especially in natural resources and petroleum, oil. And I'll show you in a minute that the nationalization of the oil sector and tight authoritarian control of the economy was a critical component of the PRI's electoral success. And unsurprisingly, they never pursued aggressive neoliberal reforms, and they certainly didn't imperil their grip on the state sector and their capacity to use it to dispense patronage and to prop up their political position and strengthen their rule. Now, it is important to note that the PRI did allow elections and that there was competition, in that the alternatives were often formidable and themselves relatively strong organizationally, but never strong enough to really alter the outcome. And more importantly, the PRI was tilting the playing field and using corruption and election irregularities and systematically abusing their control of state resources in order to hold on to power and to really rig elections before the votes were cast. And so there was real competition, but the system itself was set up to perpetuate the rule of the PRI, and it did for, 71 71 years. I almost said 81 years. 71 years. Let's watch a video that puts this in perspective and talks about the economic component in the role of authoritarian control of the state sector.
To understand political power in Mexico, it's essential to know the history of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. The PRI was created by military elites clinging to power after winning the Mexican Revolution. In 1928, revolutionary leader Álvaro Obregón was assassinated. General Plutarco Elias Calles came into power, and in 1929, he created the PRI's predecessor, the National Revolutionary Party, or PNR. El PRI domina. Historian Lorenzo Mayer says, since the party's birth, it was designed to exercise the power Calles inherited.
Así nace el PRI en 1929.
That's how the PRI was born in 1929. The party was not born to win power. It was not born to compete for power. It already had power.
In 1934, Calles named his successor, another revolutionary general, Lázaro Cárdenas. In 1938, Cárdenas nationalized the oil sector, creating the state-owned oil company Pemex. He said he did it for the benefit of the nation.
This is a clear and evident case that obligates the government to apply the law of expropriation, not only to subject the oil companies to obedience, but also because they've broken labor contracts with their workers.
By 1946, the PRM changed its name for the last time to the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. long period of economic growth marked by authoritarian controls characterized Mexico in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
So there you have it. One party rule typically coincides with statist economic policies and extensive authoritarian control of the economy. And that's by design, and it's part of what sustains and perpetuates one party rule. And it's important because it means that we should expect single party regimes to resist privatization, to resist neoliberal reform, and to generally cling to power, both politically and economically. And it's notable that in Mexico, reforms and policy change were never that extensive during the pre period. And when the pre eventually lost power, it had to do with a combination of factors that weakened their traditional forms of influence and that also began to exact and take a bit of an economic toll. So there is a close relationship between politics and economics. And in the case of authoritarianism, there are certain types of political economic institutions that go hand in hand and that tend to reproduce each other. Now, it's noteworthy that in other countries in Latin America, like, say, Colombia, they also had ISI policies, but they had less state control. And that corresponded often with more electoral competition and higher levels of democracy. And in the general question of regime type and the type of economy begins to present itself. And we might ask, whether China has democracy in its future, or if it will remain a sort of mixed economy. I think more generally, it's important for us to ask what any of these single party regimes might have in their future. There are cases like Vietnam, China, there's Cambodia. These are all examples of one party regimes. Botswana is another example. Do you think that we should expect economic and institutional reform in the future in those countries, or will China remain a a mixed economy and a single party regime?
I think that it, they're likely to stay a single party, at least for the foreseeable future. And it's especially relevant right now, actually, with Biden in the current presidency. There's a lot of push to try to say that democracy is still working while the authoritarian regimes have actually been excelling recently.
So, based on this lecture, do you think, and this is a question for anyone and everyone, do you think that China will pursue deeper neoliberal economic reforms like privatization, or do you think that they will sustain this sort of mixed model that they've kind of settled on? Any ideas? Will China pursue deeper economic reform, or will it sustain this current mixed model? All right, everybody, I think we're out of time, but we can address the question on Monday. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.
Thank you. I hope you have a good weekend too.
You too, Max.